My youngest son Daniel, who's an airline pilot, called me. "Mom, something weird is going on. Is my sister-in-law at the house?" "Yes," I answered. "She's in the shower." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's impossible because I'm holding her passport in my hands. She just boarded my flight to France." At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. "I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my revenge story from. I want to know how far it has reached. This morning, like any other day, I was rushing to wash the dishes after breakfast. Stephen, my oldest son, had left for work early, leaving the house in silence. My grandson Matthew, that clever 7-year-old little devil, had already been picked up by the school bus. And Sarah, my daughter-in-law Stephen's wife, had just gone upstairs. Her soft voice reached me. "Mom, I'm going to take a quick shower, okay?" I nodded with a smile. I had just finished putting away the last plate when the landline rang. I dried my hands on my apron and walked quickly to answer it. The cheerful young voice of Daniel, my younger son, filled the line. "Mom, just calling to say hi. I had some free time during a layover at the airport." Hearing his voice was a warm hug for my heart. Daniel is my pride, a young co-pilot who is always on the go, living the dream of conquering the skies that he's had since he was a boy. I smiled and asked him a few things about his flight, about how he was doing. He laughed loudly and told me everything was going well, that work was running smoothly. But suddenly, his tone changed, as if he was hesitant to say something. "Hey, Mom, something really weird happened. Is my sister-in-law at the house?" I was puzzled. I looked towards the stairs where I could still hear the water running in the bathroom. "Of course, son. Sarah is taking a shower upstairs." I answered, very sure of myself. Sarah had spoken to me less than 10 minutes ago, and she was wearing that white blouse she always wore around the house. How could I be mistaken? But on the other end of the line, Daniel was quiet for a long time. So long I could hear him breathing. Then his voice became very serious, full of astonishment. "Mom, that's impossible. Because I have her passport right here in my hand. She just got on my flight to France." I started to laugh, thinking he must have been mistaken. "Oh, son, you must have seen wrong. I just saw Sarah. She even told me she was going to take a shower." I tried to explain calmly to reassure him, but he didn't laugh. He didn't answer like he usually did. He told me, his voice slow, as if he was trying to sort out the story in his head, that after all the passengers had boarded, he ran out to get some papers he had forgotten, and by chance he found a passport lying near the boarding gate. At first, he thought about giving it to the airport staff, but when he opened it to see whose it was, he froze. The photo was of Sarah. Her name was there, clear as day. There was no way to be mistaken. My heart started to beat faster, but I tried to stay calm. "Are you sure, Daniel, that passport could belong to someone else?" I said, although a thorn of unease had already pricked me. Daniel sighed, and his voice was now a mix of bewilderment and firmness. "Mom, I just went down to the passenger cabin to check. It's her. She's sitting in first class, next to a man who looks very rich and elegant. They were talking very closely, like they were a couple." Daniel's words were like a stab wound. I stood frozen, clutching the phone's receiver, my head spinning, like they were a couple impossible. I had just heard Sarah's voice from upstairs. I had just seen her in the flesh in this very house. But right at that moment, the sound of the water in the bathroom stopped. The bedroom door opened, and Sarah's voice drifted down the stairs, soft but loud enough to make me jump. "Mom, who's on the phone?" I panicked. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it was going to burst out of my chest. "Oh, just a friend of mine," I answered quickly, my voice trembling, and I rushed into the living room to avoid Sarah's gaze as she peeked her head from the stairs, her hair still dripping wet. I closed the door and whispered into the phone, trying to hide my nervousness. "Daniel, I just heard Sarah. She's here. She just took a shower. Are you sure you weren't mistaken?" On the other end, Daniel was quiet again. And then his voice became harder. "Mom, that's impossible. I have her right in front of me on this plane. I'm looking right at her." I was speechless, my mind blank. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the receiver. The living room suddenly felt suffocating, even though the sun was shining brightly outside. I sank onto the sofa trying to take a deep breath, but my chest felt tight with an unanswered question. If Sarah was here, who was the woman on Daniel's flight? And if the one on the flight was Sarah, who was the person in my house? A few minutes later, Sarah came down to the kitchen. She was wearing a clean light blue dress, her hair still damp, and she smiled with the same sweetness as always. "Mom, I'm going to the market early today. Do you want me to bring back any vegetables or anything?" Her voice was kind, familiar, as if nothing strange was happening. I looked at her, trying to force a smile, but inside I felt like I was carrying stones. "Yes, honey, bring some tomatoes, please," I replied, my throat dry. Sarah nodded, picked up her wicker basket, and left the house. Her silhouette disappeared behind the gate. I stood there watching her go, a whirlwind in my soul. I didn't believe Daniel was lying to me. My son had no reason to make up a story like that. He has always been an upright young man, very sensitive and loving with his family. But Sarah, the daughter-in-law I've lived with for so many years, was also in front of me in the flesh, unmistakable. I asked myself, is there something I've missed? Is there a secret in this house that I, an old woman, have never noticed? I sat in silence in the living room as the midday light filtered through the curtains, drawing faint stripes of light on the tile floor. The old armchair where I always sit to knit or read stories to Matthew now seemed heavier too. Daniel's call kept echoing in my head. Each of his words was like a hammer blow to my heart. I looked around the room where the family photos hung. Stephen and Sarah on their wedding day, newborn Matthew and Daniel's radiant smile when he first put on his pilot's uniform. All those memories now seemed covered by a fog, blurry and full of doubt. I'm Stella Miller, a 65-year-old widow living in a quiet middle-class neighborhood in Chicago. My husband Robert passed away 10 years ago, leaving me with the two sons I love more than my own life. Stephen, the older one, is a hard-working architect, always buried in his blueprints and projects. And Daniel, the younger one, is my pride for making his dream of being a pilot come true. My life revolves around Stephen's small family, my daughter-in-law Sarah, my grandson Matthew, and the quiet days in this house. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, was always the perfect model in my eyes. She was pretty hardworking, always impeccable from the way she dressed to how she cared for Matthew. I still remember their wedding day, a big party held in the backyard of her parents' house. Although Sarah's family wasn't wealthy, they did their best to make everything perfect. Sarah entered my home with a confident smile, a bright gaze as if she were born to be a wonderful wife and mother. I thought how lucky I was to have a daughter-in-law like her. After Sarah left for the market, I sat there unconsciously gripping the edge of the tablecloth. Daniel's call made me review small details that had previously seemed normal. There were days when Sarah would leave the house saying she was going to the market or to see a friend, but when she returned, she seemed like a different person. One day she was all sweetness, hugging Matthew and singing him to sleep, but other days she was in a bad mood and would yell at me just because I forgot to put the salt shaker in its place. I used to think it was the mood swings of a young woman, but now I wasn't so sure. My heart was in a knot, as if someone was scrambling all the memories I cherished so much. I remember once, a few months ago, Sarah picked up a pen to write the grocery list with her right hand. Her handwriting was very neat and careful, but the next day I saw her use her left hand, and she wrote more sloppily, as if she wasn't used to it. I asked her, "Since when do you write with your other hand, honey?" She laughed and answered quickly, "Oh, I'm just practicing for fun, Mom." I nodded, not giving it much thought, but now that detail had become a sharp piece in my mind. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard the door open. Matthew came running in his backpack, bouncing on his back. He hugged me tightly, saying in his little sparrow voice, "Grandma, the teacher praised me today because my drawing was so good." I stroked his head, trying to smile, but I still felt a weight in my chest. Matthew sat down and took out his notebook to show me. "Grandma, look, yesterday my mom helped me with my homework with her right hand, and her handwriting was really pretty, but today she wrote with her left, and it came out messier." The boy pointed to 2 pages in the notebook, one with well-formed letters and the other with crooked handwriting. I looked at the letters and felt my heart sink. "Your mom must have been busy today. She was probably tired, and that's why she wrote like that." I said, trying to hide my confusion, but Matthew looked up with his innocent eyes. Grandma, my mom is really weird. Some days she hugs me really, really tight, but other days she doesn't even look at me. My grandson's words were another stab. I hugged him, trying to comfort him, but in my head, everything was starting to get tangled. Just then, the doorbell rang. I got up, opened the door, and saw Linda, my good neighbor, standing there with the dish Sarah had taken to her the day before. She smiled at me with that same kind smile as always, but there was curiosity in her eyes. Stella, your daughter-in-law is so lovely, but yesterday I noticed she gave me the dish with her left hand, and I thought you told me she was right-handed, right? How strange, or maybe she's ambidextrous. I forced a smile and answered, Maybe she is, Linda. Won't you come in for some tea? She nodded and came in, but her comment stuck in me like a thorn. Not just me, even the neighbors had noticed the difference. I served her tea. We chatted about random things, but as soon as she left, I collapsed onto the sofa, my hand on my chest. I was frozen, feeling like the world was crashing down on me. That afternoon, I went out to the garden with the watering can in my hand, trying to let the water fall gently on the daisies I've cared for years. The sun was beginning to set, the shadows of the trees were stretching across the yard, but my soul could not find peace. The words of Matthew, of Linda, and Daniel's firm voice on the phone kept spinning in my head like pebbles thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that wouldn't stop. I was watering the plants, but my mind wasn't there. I wondered, am I getting too old to notice the strange things happening in my own house? Or have I purposely turned a blind eye, wanting to believe in the happy family I always dreamed of? Sarah returned from the market carrying her wicker basket, but what caught my attention was that she was holding it with her left hand. I remembered perfectly that Sarah always used her right hand, from how she held the knife to chop vegetables to how she combed Matthew's hair. I stood there watching her put the basket on the kitchen table, and I asked in a low voice, "What did you buy, Sarah?" My voice tried to sound natural, but inside a wave of suspicion was growing. She smiled and answered very politely, "Yes, Mom. I brought some tomatoes, cilantro, and some fresh fish. I'm going to make that grilled fish you like tonight. Sound good?" Her voice was soft as always, but I couldn't help but notice her hands. The left one, not the right. I nodded and turned away, pretending to clean the table, but my heart was pounding. Was I imagining things? Or were these little details trying to tell me something? At dinner time, the whole family gathered at the table. Stephen was tired after a long day at work, but he still smiled at Matthew and asked him how school was. Sarah ate slowly, delicately, and even turned to Stephen to remind him. "Honey, next week is Matthew's parent-teacher conference, so make sure to save the date, okay?" I looked at her, trying to find the daughter-in-law I was so proud of, but in my head, Daniel's voice kept echoing. "She's sitting in first class next to a man." I bit my lip, trying to swallow my anguish, but it felt like a stone stuck in my throat. Just 3 days later, everything was different. Matthew dropped a glass of water during dinner, and the water splashed all over the tablecloth. I quickly grabbed a cloth to clean it up, laughing. "It's okay, sweetie. Just be more careful." But Sarah, sitting across from him, suddenly frowned and said in a sharp voice, "Matthew, why are you so clumsy? Be more careful." I was stunned, looking at Stephen. He also frowned and said in a low voice, "Sarah, it was an accident, that's all." She turned with a flash of anger in her eyes. "You always defend him, and I'm left looking like the bad guy in this house." The atmosphere at the table became heavy. Matthew lowered his head, his eyes full of tears. I hugged him, feeling a deep pain. Just a few days ago, Sarah had been tenderly reminding him about school, and now she seemed like a completely different person. I sat next to him, watching in silence, trying to piece things together in my head. Today she was irritable, the other day she was a sweetheart. Today she used her left hand, the other day her right. These small differences, one by one, were accumulating in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet see completely. I told myself I had to calm down, but every time I looked at Sarah, I saw a stranger, as if she wasn't the daughter-in-law I had lived with for so many years. A few days later, I took Matthew to school. He held my hand as we walked down the familiar cobblestone street. Suddenly he stopped, looked at me, and said in a sad voice, "Grandma, yesterday my mom taught me how to write, and she was very patient. Her handwriting was really pretty, but today she didn't even want to look at my homework. She told me to do it myself." I knelt down to look into his clear little eyes, and I felt my heart break. "Your mom was busy, honey, don't be sad," I said, but my voice was trembling. Matthew nodded, but his gaze was still full of disappointment. I hugged him, feeling an immense helplessness. "You're only 7 years old. How could you understand something that even I couldn't figure out?" That night we sat down to dinner again. Suddenly, Sarah took a small notebook out of her purse and started writing something with her left hand. Stephen, who was serving himself food, suddenly laughed. "Hey, since when do you write with your left hand? You look really weird." Sarah stopped short, a forced smile on her lips. "Oh, I'm just trying it out, honey." She quickly put the notebook back in her purse, but I noticed a flash of panic in her eyes. Stephen shook his head and said nothing more, but I knew he had noticed something strange, too. I sat there clutching my spoon, trying to keep a straight face, but inside the doubts were growing like a slow fire. One morning I took the empty spice jar and crossed the familiar cobblestone street to go to Linda's house. Sarah had borrowed it a few weeks ago, saying it was to make the pot roast that Stephen loves so much. I knocked on the door, and Linda opened it with her usual kind smile. "Stella, come on in, let me make you some coffee," she said, still with a cloth in her hand. I gave her the jar, planning to thank her and leave, but she pulled me to sit in a wooden chair in her kitchen. The atmosphere was warm, smelling of roasted coffee, but I couldn't relax. Linda looked at me, her eyes full of doubt, and lowered her voice. "Stella, don't get mad at what I'm about to say. Has your daughter-in-law had a change of character? One day she greets me so happily, even asks about my kids, but yesterday she passed by here. I waved at her and she completely ignored me like she didn't know me." Linda's words were another stone in the troubled lake of my heart. I forced a smile and answered, "She must have been in a hurry, Linda. You know how young people are these days." But inside I was a mess. I knew Linda wasn't just talking to talk. She's a very sentimental person who always pays attention to details. If even she noticed how strange Sarah was, then my suspicions were no longer just my imagination. I stayed a little longer, sipped the now cold coffee, and said goodbye to leave with a heavy heart. On my way back, I passed by David's bakery, where I always buy donuts for Matthew. David was serving customers, and when he saw me, he smiled. "Mrs. Stella, what are we getting for the champ today?" I asked for some donuts, and suddenly he asked, "You're Stephen's mom, right? His wife came in the other day, so nice, she even told me how delicious my bread was. But this morning, she came again with a real scowl on her face. Bought the bread, didn't even say thank you, and left straight away." I stood frozen, clutching the handle of my bag. "She must have been tired, David," I replied, my voice trembling. I thanked him quickly and left. David's words were another knife cutting deeper into the doubts that were growing inside me. When I got home, I made myself some tea and sat on the porch. The wind was blowing gently, bringing the scent of the daisies from the garden. I looked towards the street that leads to the market the way Sarah always went. Suddenly, I saw her returning carrying her grocery bag, but she greeted me with a dry voice. "Good afternoon, Mom." No smile, none of yesterday's joy when she boasted about getting a good deal on a bunch of cilantro. I nodded and answered in a low voice, "You're back." But inside, I couldn't help but watch her more closely. The blouse she was wearing today was navy blue, different from the white blouse she was wearing when she left. I tried to ask her in a soft voice, "Why did you change your blouse?" Sarah stopped for a second and then answered quickly, "Oh, I got a stain on it and had to change." She gave a half smile and quickly went into the kitchen. I stayed there with the teacup in my hands, feeling as if a rock was crushing my chest. The words of Linda, of David, and the way Sarah answered me all forced me to stop ignoring things. That night we were all having dinner. Matthew was talking about school with his cheerful little voice, but I noticed that Sarah only nodded without responding to him like other times. When Stephen asked him, "Are you done eating? So your mom can clear the plates?" Matthew suddenly turned to me and said with innocence, "Grandma, my mom didn't sing me to sleep tonight. Yesterday she did sing me the old song you always sing to me, and it sounds so pretty." I looked at Sarah, who was serving herself food without reacting, But Matthew's words were like a pinprick in my heart. That lullaby, "You Are My Sunshine," that I used to sing to Stephen and Daniel, only Sarah and I knew it in this house. So why did she sing it yesterday and not today? Why did she change so quickly? I got up to clear the plates, but my mind was no longer there. I remembered the time Sarah left the house saying she was going to see a friend, but came back with a strange look in her eyes. One day she brought a bouquet of fresh flowers, saying a friend had given them to her, but another day she got angry when I asked, "Where did you go today that you got back so late?" I used to think they were unimportant things, but now they seemed like pieces of a much bigger secret. I didn't want to believe that Sarah was hiding something from me, but every word, every gesture of hers made me doubt. That night, after cleaning the kitchen, I sat at the dining room table and took an old notebook out of a drawer. My hand was shaking as I wrote the first line. 3 p.m, Sarah leaves for the market, returns at 6, wearing a blue blouse, irritable attitude. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. I kept writing. Yesterday she sang Matthew to sleep tender. Today cold didn't sing to him. Each word was a heavy stroke, as if I were etching my suspicions into reality. My old notebook was now filled with notes about Sarah. Each letter was a piece of my doubt, as if I were painting a picture I didn't dare to look at. I sat in the kitchen looking at the notebook with a heavy heart. I couldn't keep all these thoughts to myself anymore. They were like waves rising and falling, leaving me alone in my confusion. I needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand me, who wouldn't judge me, who wouldn't jump to conclusions. I immediately thought of Linda, my soulmate, the one who has been with me since we were young, when we used to sit and knit under a tree and tell each other our lives. I picked up the phone, my voice trembling. "Linda, are you free this afternoon? Let's go to the corner coffee shop. I need to talk." Linda accepted instantly, her voice as warm as ever. "Stella, I knew something was wrong. Wait for me, I'm on my way." I felt a little relief, but the worry was still weighing on me. I put on my old shawl and left the house, heading for the small corner coffee shop where Linda and I have shared so many joys and sorrows. The place was still the same, with its dark wooden tables and that delicious smell of freshly roasted coffee. I chose a table in a corner where the light was dim so no one would hear our conversation. I sat there hugging the hot coffee cup, but with a frozen soul. I wondered, how am I going to tell her all these suspicions? How am I going to dare to admit that I'm doubting my own daughter-in-law, Linda, arrived wearing a light sweater and carrying a bag of fresh vegetables? She sat down, looked me straight in the eye with that sharp but affectionate gaze. "Stella, just by looking at your face, I know something serious is wrong. Come on, spill it. What's got you so down?" I took a deep breath, trying not to let my voice break, but every word got stuck in my throat. I told her everything in summary. The call from the airport, Sarah's passport, the woman identical to her on the plane, and all the little details I had noted down, from how she switched hands to write to her mood swings from day to night. I took the notebook out of my bag and passed it to her. "Look, I wrote it all down here. I don't know if I'm imagining it, but I can't fool myself anymore." Linda turned the pages, her brow furrowed. She read slowly, her fingers tracing my trembling handwriting. "You've noticed everything, Stella," she said in a serious voice. "Every time she leaves and comes back, it's like she's a different person. What do you think it is?" I shook my head, clutching the coffee cup. "I don't know, Linda. I just know I'm scared. Scared that Sarah is hiding something. Scared that my family will break apart if I dig deeper. But I can't stop. I have to know the truth for Stephen, for Matthew." Linda put her cup down on the table and looked at me with determination. "Women are not easily fooled, Stella. What does your gut tell you? I'm sure there's something fishy going on here. You have to get to the bottom of this." I hesitated, and my voice became a whisper. "But what if I'm judging her wrongly? What if I hurt Stephen?" Linda interrupted me firmly. "Trust your instincts. If you don't uncover the truth, you'll live with the doubt forever, and you won't be able to protect Matthew or Stephen that way." Just then, Mrs. Mary, the lady who sells vegetables at the market and whom I know came into the coffee shop. She recognized me and smiled. "Mrs. Stella, what a coincidence! Last week I saw your daughter-in-law at the market. She greeted me so nicely, even bought an extra bunch of cilantro from me for cooking. But this morning she came by again very serious, didn't even say hello, bought her vegetables and left. Is something wrong with your daughter-in-law? I forced a smile and answered, She must be tired, Mary. But inside I felt like I was suffocating, another person who noticed how strange Sarah was. I thanked Mrs. Mary, watched her leave, and turned back to Linda, surely with panic reflected in my eyes. Linda took my hand, and her voice softened. You see, Stella, it's not just you, even the neighbors notice. Don't fool yourself anymore. Keep writing everything down, and if necessary, you'll have to follow her. Not to harm her, but to protect your family. I nodded, but I felt my heart sink. I knew Linda was right, but the idea of following my own daughter-in-law made me feel like I was betraying my family. I have spent my whole life taking care of this home, and now I had to do something I never imagined: investigate one of my own. That afternoon I returned home, my head still a mess. Sarah left the house carrying her familiar blue basket. "Mom, I'm just going to the market for a moment," she said in a soft voice. I nodded, but as soon as she disappeared behind the gate, I opened my notebook and wrote, 3 in the afternoon. Sarah leaves for the market carrying a blue basket, normal attitude. I stood there watching the clock, counting every minute. At 6, Sarah returned, but the basket she was carrying was now red. I was surprised and asked her, "Did you change baskets?" She smiled and answered quickly, "Yes, the other one broke and a friend lent me this one." I nodded, but my hands were shaking as I added in the notebook, "Returns at 6 in the afternoon, carrying a red basket." Voice a little rushed. My notes were piling up. Each line was another step closer to the truth, but also a step that took me away from the image of the old mother who only knows how to love and trust. On the weekend, Stephen went to work overtime early in the morning, and Matthew was at a school activity, leaving the house quiet just for me and Sarah. I was cleaning the dining room table, trying to keep myself busy to ward off the doubts that were eating away at me. But then Sarah came down from her room, wearing a pale yellow floral dress, as fresh as in her early days of marriage. "Mom, I'm going to the market for a little while," she said in a soft voice. She took her wicker basket and left. I nodded with a smile, but inside, a voice insisted, "Follow her, Stella. Go find the truth." I didn't think twice. I grabbed my old shawl, put it over my head to cover my face a little, and left the house, silently keeping a safe distance behind Sarah. The sun was beating down, sweat was soaking my back, but I didn't care. I just wanted to know where she was really going, what she was doing. Sarah walked quickly down the cobblestone street that leads to the market, but suddenly, instead of turning right as usual, she turned left into an alley behind an industrial area. The houses were old, crammed together with peeling walls and rusty tin roofs. I slowed down, my heart pounding a mile a minute, trying to hide behind some bicycles parked on the sidewalk. Sarah didn't look back. She kept walking, went into an even narrower alley where the sunlight barely reached. I hid behind an auto repair shop where a man was very focused on tightening nuts. I saw Sarah stop in front of an old wooden door, knock softly, and then go inside and disappear. I stood there, my breath ragged and my head spinning. What was my daughter-in-law doing there? This wasn't the market nor the house of any of the friends she had mentioned. I wanted to walk over there, knock on the door, ask her directly, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. I was afraid of the truth, afraid that what I was about to discover would break everything. In the end, I turned around and went back home full of questions, each step heavier than the last. As soon as I pushed open the gate of the house, I froze. Sarah was standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, wearing a white blouse, completely different from the floral dress she had left in. She had a frown on her face, and she looked at me with cold, sharp eyes. "Where did you go, Mom, that you're just getting back?" I stood frozen, my mouth dry, unable to say a word. Just a few minutes ago, I had seen her go into that alley, wearing a yellow dress. How could she have returned so quickly? "And this blouse," I stammered. I just went for a walk." Sarah nodded without saying anything more, but her gaze gave me a chill. I went up to my room pretending I was going to look for something, but really it was to escape that look, to calm my heart that was racing in my chest. That night, I was sitting knitting when Matthew came running into my room, his cheeks flushed from playing in the yard. He hugged my legs, sobbing. "Oh, Grandma, my mom yelled at me today, just because I dropped a pencil. Not like yesterday. Yesterday, she was really nice. She even hugged me." I took Matthew in my arms, stroked his head, but inside I felt like I was burning. "Your mom was tired, sweetie. Don't be sad," I said, but my voice was trembling. Matthew hid his face in my shoulder and whispered, "Oh, Grandma, I want yesterday's mom." I hugged him tighter, tears about to spill from my eyes. My grandson's words were like a knife carving the suspicions I was trying to suppress even deeper. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The images repeated over and over in my head. Sarah in the floral dress going into the alley, Sarah in the white blouse standing in the kitchen, and Daniel's voice. "She's on my flight." I took the notebook out of the drawer and wrote a sentence that I myself didn't dare to believe. Maybe they are not the same person. That sentence felt like a curse and made me tremble. The next morning I decided to go back to that alley. I couldn't bear the doubt any longer. I took the family photo that hangs in the living room, the one where Sarah is smiling radiantly next to Stephen and Matthew. I held it tight and left the house determined but scared to death. The alley was the same as yesterday, quiet and gloomy. I stopped by a corn-on-the-cob stand where a middle-aged woman was fanning the coals. I showed her the photo and asked her, "Excuse me, have you seen this young woman around here?" The woman looked at it closely and then pointed. "Oh, yes, of course. She goes in and out of the house at number 14, that one over there, all the time." I thanked her, my heart pounding in my throat, and walked straight to that house. House number 14 appeared before me with stained walls, a peeling wooden door, and a pot with a withered daisy in the window frame. I stood there, my hands trembling, feeling like the whole world was holding its breath with me. I knocked on the door, and each knock sounded like a hammer blow to my chest. The door opened, and I was speechless. In front of me was a woman identical to Sarah from her face, her body to her long black hair. The only difference was her frightened eyes and her trembling hands as she held a rag. I stammered, my voice breaking. "Sarah!" The girl started clutch the rag tightly and tried to slam the door shut, but just then another voice was heard from inside, a soft but firm voice. "Isabella, don't hide anymore. You also know this is wrong." I looked up and saw a young woman come out of a corner of the room standing right behind the woman who was identical to Sarah. She was thin with her hair pulled back, and she had an intelligent but kind look. She looked at me and smiled slightly. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Lucy Valera, Isabella's roommate. Mrs. Stella, please come in. It's time for you to know the truth." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my legs from shaking, and went into that small, cramped tin house. The walls were stained, the concrete floor cracked, and a faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air. In a corner, an elderly man was coughing weakly, lying on an old cot covered with a threadbare blanket. I felt like the space was crushing me, but I still walked and sat in the wooden chair that Lucy pointed to. The woman identical to Sarah lowered her face, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Forgive me, I'm not Sarah. My name is Isabella." I looked at her, my mind a whirlwind, unable to say anything. Isabella. The name was strange, but the face was all too familiar. I clenched my hands, trying to keep my voice steady. "You explained to me, why do you look so much like my daughter-in-law, and why do you show up at my house?" Isabella looked up, her eyes full of guilt, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, Lucy sat next to her, poured a glass of water from an old plastic pitcher, and began to speak. "Isabella is very poor, Mrs. Stella," Lucy said in a calm, clear voice. "Her adoptive parents are very ill, especially the man lying over there. A few years ago, Isabella met Sarah by chance at a market. They looked like two peas in a pod, and Sarah took advantage of that. She proposed that Isabella pretend to be her to replace her for a few hours whenever she needed. Isabella didn't want to, but Sarah paid her very well, and her family needed the money for medicine." I looked at Isabella and saw that her head was bowed, clutching the rag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I pressed her, my voice full of disbelief. "Replace her for what? Why would Sarah need someone to impersonate her?" Isabella looked up, her voice trembling. I don't know everything, ma'am. She just told me you just stay in the house for a few hours, do some things like go to the market, take care of the boy, and that's it. She gave me money, a lot of money, enough to buy my parents' medicine. I didn't dare to ask for more. She lowered her head and tears began to roll down her cheeks. I looked at her, feeling my chest tighten. Every strange detail of the past few months suddenly made sense. The change of hand for writing the sometimes sweet and sometimes sour character, the sometimes honeyed and sometimes cold voice. It all fit now like the last pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see. Lucy continued with a sharper gaze. I don't know if this helps, but once I saw Sarah with a very elegant man. His name is Victor Quinn. I heard the name when they were talking in a coffee shop. They were calling each other my love, very affectionate. At that time, Isabella was waiting outside in the car, not understanding anything. The name Victor Quinn was like a knife in my heart. I remembered Daniel's words. She's sitting in first class next to a rich man. The small room seemed to spin around me. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking so much that I knocked over the glass of water. Lucy hurried to clean it up, but I just shook my head, my voice choked. Sarah, is she cheating on my family? Isabella broke down crying. Her voice choked. Forgive me, ma'am, I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to save my parents. I looked at her, this young woman with a face identical to Sarah's, but with eyes full of pain and regret. I wanted to be angry, I wanted to scream, but looking at Isabella, I only felt pity. She wasn't the mastermind, she was just a piece in Sarah's game. Everything was falling apart before my eyes. I stood up, trying to make my voice sound firm. Isabella, do you know where Sarah is? Do you know what she does when she asks you to impersonate her? Isabella shook her head, still crying. I don't know, ma'am. She just told me to do what she asked and that she would pay me. I didn't dare to ask for more. Lucy put a hand on her shoulder to comfort her and then turned to me. Mrs. Stella, I know this is very painful for you, but Isabella is also a victim. She had no other choice. I looked around the humble house, listening to the weak cough of the man on the cot. I understood Isabella's desperation, but that didn't erase the feeling of betrayal I felt. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the tears. I don't blame you, Isabella, but I need to know the truth. I need to protect my son and my grandson. I stood up, feeling like the world was crashing down on me. Thank you, Lucy, for telling me the truth. I'll be back. Soon. I left the house, and the bright sun outside blinded me, but my heart was frozen. The next morning, I went back to that little alley where the stained walls and peeling wooden door had become an obsession in my mind. The sun was still beating down, but I felt a coldness inside, as if I were carrying an icy wind of unresolved doubts. I knocked on the door of number 14, clutching the family photo as if it were a charm to give me the courage to face the truth. This time, Isabella didn't seem so scared. She opened the door with a still shy but calmer look and invited me in. Mrs. Stella, I was waiting for you. Please come in. The house was still small, with that smell of disinfectant and the weak cough of the man on the cot. I sat in the old wooden chair and looked at Isabella. She was wearing a simple blouse, her hair loosely pulled back. She looked tired but no longer frightened. I took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Isabella, I want to meet your adoptive mother. I need to understand all of this better. Isabella nodded and took me to a corner of the room where a very thin woman with completely white hair was lying in bed, her cloudy eyes staring at the ceiling. It was Mrs. Felicity Morris, Isabella's adoptive mother. I took her thin hand and introduced myself. I'm Stella Miller, Stephen's mother, Sarah's husband. Mrs. Felicity looked at me, breathing with difficulty, and said in a weak voice, Isabella, she's not my biological daughter. She's a child I adopted when she was a newborn. Her words were like a hammer blow to my head. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, but I tried to make my voice sound calm. Tell me, please, how did it all happen? The lady coughed, and then slowly she began to tell me a story I was not prepared for. Many years ago, I was a nurse in a small hospital in a village. She began, her voice trembling. A very poor family had twin girls. They were so poor they couldn't keep both. The mother was crying, saying she could only keep one. The other they were going to abandon. My heart broke. I couldn't let them abandon that creature, so I adopted her. That's Isabella. She paused to cough for a long time, and then looked at Isabella with immense love. I raised her as if she were my own, but I know she has always wanted to find her real parents. I have nothing to give her other than my love and this house. I sat there gripping the edge of the chair, my head spinning. "Do you know who Isabella's biological parents are?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mrs. Felicity shook her head. "I only know that they were a poor family from a nearby village. I didn't ask much. I just wanted to save the girl." I looked at Isabella and saw her with her head bowed, with tears rolling down her face. "Mrs. Stella, I don't know anything about my biological parents," she said, her voice choked. "But when I met Sarah, I thought maybe she knew something. She looks so much like me, but she never told me anything about that." I felt like I couldn't breathe. I asked Mrs. Felicity to let me see her old papers, hoping to find some clue. She pointed to an old wooden wardrobe. Isabella took out a yellowish paper envelope and gave it to me. Inside was a copy of some hospital papers with Isabella's date of birth. I read them quickly and felt my heart stop. Isabella's date of birth was exactly the same as Sarah's, the one I had seen on her papers when she married Stephen. I grabbed the documents with trembling hands and looked at Isabella. You and Sarah, could you be twin sisters?" I said, my voice lost. Isabella burst into tears, covering her face. "So Sarah is my sister. Why didn't she tell me anything? Why did she make me do all that?" I looked at her with a broken heart. I remembered the days when Sarah came to my house radiant and confident, as if she were born to be the perfect wife and mother. I had loved her. I had believed she would bring happiness to Stephen. But now I knew that not only had she deceived my family, but she had also taken advantage of her own sister, using her as her double to hide secrets I didn't even dare to imagine. I stood up, put my hand on Isabella's shoulder, and my voice, though firm, could not hide the pain. "Isabella, from today on, I'm not going to let anyone else take advantage of you. I'm going to help your parents with their illness, but in return, you have to cooperate with me. I need to bring this truth to light for Stephen, for Matthew." Isabella nodded, still crying. "I'll help you. I don't want to live in this lie anymore." I looked at her and saw sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time I felt a ray of hope in the midst of the storm. I left the house, walked through the alley, my soul in turmoil. I passed by the bustling market where people were buying and laughing, but in my mind, Mrs. Felicity's words echoed like bells. Two twins, one abandoned, the other raised, and now their fates had crossed in my own family. I returned home with my soul in a mess like a field after a storm. The truth about Sarah and Isabella, the secret of the twins, was a rock that was crushing my chest. I was at a crossroads for which I was not prepared. To confront my daughter-in-law, the woman who had deceived us all, and reveal the truth to Stephen and Matthew. That night I called Daniel. My voice was firm, though my heart was trembling. "Daniel, tomorrow night you have to come to the house. There are some things I need you to clarify." Daniel was surprised. I could hear the concern in his voice. "Mom, did something serious happen?" I said curtly. "You just come, son. I need you. And if you can bring Sarah's electronic passport." He didn't ask any more questions, just said, "Yes, Mom, I'll be there." I hung up and sat down, feeling like the whole world was crashing down on me. I knew that tomorrow night would be one that no one in this family would ever forget. The next day, I got up early and prepared a big family dinner. I put a white tablecloth on the table. I lit some candles. I cooked the pot roast that Stephen loves so much and the grilled fish that Matthew always asks for. I wanted this dinner to be special, not to celebrate, but to mark a before and after. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, but my mind was elsewhere, between that gloomy alley and Isabella's words. I told myself I had to be strong for Stephen, for Matthew, but every cut of the knife felt like a cut in my own heart. Stephen came home as it started to get dark, tired from work. Seeing the table set, he was surprised. "And what are we celebrating now that you've made so much food, Mom?" I smiled, trying to seem calm. I just wanted us all to have a nice dinner. Sit down, son." Sarah came in wearing her light blue dress, a soft smile, but with a hint of nervousness in her eyes. Matthew ran to hug my legs. "Grandma, the fish smells so good." I stroked his head, a lump in my throat. I knew that after tonight, Matthew's innocent smile might never be so carefree again. We sat down at the table, and at first the atmosphere was lively. Stephen talked about work. Matthew spoke excitedly about the drawing he made at school. Sarah nodded, commenting from time to time, but I noticed her hand trembled slightly as she held her spoon. I took a deep breath and motioned to Daniel, who was waiting outside. He came in, and right behind him was Isabella in a simple dress, her face identical to Sarah's, but with a look full of anguish. Everyone at the table fell silent. Matthew looked confused from Sarah to Isabella and asked innocently, "Why are there two mommies?" Stephen turned pale, dropped his spoon, and Sarah jumped up, shouting, "What is all this about, Mom?" I stood up, holding on to the edge of the table so I wouldn't tremble. "Sit down, Sarah," I said, my voice slow but firm. "I need us to clear everything up." I began to tell, and every word tore me apart inside. Daniel's call from the airport when he saw her on a flight to France, even though she was still at home, the times she switched hands to write her sometimes sweet and sometimes sour character, and finally my visit to the alley where I met Isabella and discovered the secret of the twins. "You and Isabella are twin sisters," I said, looking her straight in the eyes. "You took advantage of your sister to hide the truth. Tell us, what is the truth?" Sarah trembled, her face as white as paper. She screamed, trying to defend herself. "You're making everything up to humiliate me." "How dare you!" But Daniel came over and slammed a stack of papers on the table. "This is a copy of the electronic passport with the entry and exit stamp from France," he said in a harsh voice. "You can't be at home and fly to France at the same time." Sarah looked at the papers, her lips pressed together, unable to say anything. Matthew, sitting next to her, suddenly intervened with an innocent but pained voice. "It's true, Grandma. Some days my mommy is an angel, and other days she's very mean. I don't like the mean mommy." My grandson's words were like a stab, and I had to hold back from crying. The air in the room felt so heavy it was hard to breathe. I nodded and motioned to Lucy, who had just come in through the back door. She stood there with her sharp gaze and told everyone. "I saw Sarah with Victor Quinn. They were calling each other my love, and she was the one who hired Isabella to impersonate her and deceive the family." Stephen turned to his wife, his voice choked. "Is it true, Sarah? Tell me, is it true?" Sarah bit her lips, silent for a long moment, and then suddenly screamed, her voice full of fury. "Yes, it's true, I have a lover. I'm sick of this poor life, sick of being the daughter-in-law in this house. Victor gives me a life 100 times better, and you, Stephen, you're useless." Her words were like a bomb that exploded in the room. Stephen stood frozen, clenching his fists so tightly they turned white. Matthew burst into tears and ran to hug me, his voice trembling. "Grandma, what did my mommy say?" I hugged him tight, and the tears rolled down my cheeks. I looked at Sarah with a broken heart. She was standing there with a cold look, without a hint of remorse. Stephen stood up, his voice trembling. "Sarah, do you really think that—" She turned away without answering. Isabella, who had been silent on the side, suddenly spoke, her voice low but clear. "Sister, you didn't have to hurt them like this. I just wanted to help you, but I didn't know you would go this far." Sarah glared at her, but said nothing. She just turned around and walked out. The door slammed shut, leaving the room in a painful silence. After that night of confrontation, the air in my house felt like it had been robbed of life. The living room, which used to be filled with Matthew's laughter and Stephen's conversations, was now in a suffocating silence. I had lived my whole life for my family, but now I felt like someone who had just survived a hurricane, standing in the middle of the rubble of the home I had cared for so much. Sarah left after screaming those bitter words, leaving Stephen with an empty gaze, and Matthew with innocent tears. I knew everything had changed forever. A week later, Stephen and Sarah went to court for the divorce. I didn't go, but Stephen told me about it later, his voice dry, as if he had lost his soul. Mom, she didn't look at me, not at Matthew. She signed the papers and left with that man as if we had never existed. I sat next to him, took his hand, trying not to cry. Sarah didn't ask for custody of Matthew, as if the child had only been part of a play she was tired of. My heart ached not only for Stephen, but for Matthew, a 7-year-old boy who didn't deserve to be abandoned like that. "Don't worry, my son," I said, my voice trembling. "I will always be here, and Matthew will never lack for love." But inside, I knew this wound would take a long time to heal. Stephen fell apart. He became quiet, spoke little, just buried himself in his work, or sat watching Matthew play in the yard. I looked at my son and saw in his eyes the same sadness that Robert had in his last days, when he knew he could no longer stay with us. I wanted to hug him to tell him that everything would be okay, but I didn't know where to start. Luckily, Isabella appeared silent as a small light in the darkness. She came to the house every day, brought containers of hot food, sat down to play with Matthew, and wiped his tears when he asked, "Auntie, where did my real mommy go?" I looked at Isabella, saw that face identical to Sarah's, but with a completely different heart. She was sweet, patient, and always found a way to make Matthew laugh. One afternoon I saw Matthew run to hug Isabella with his cheerful little voice. "Mommy, Isabella, teach me how to draw a little bird." I was surprised, my heart clenching. The boy was calling her Mommy, with a carefree smile I hadn't seen on him in a long time. Isabella laughed and stroked his head. "Of course, my love, but you have to draw it very beautifully for me to see." I stood there, tears rolling down my face. Matthew's innocent words were like medicine that soothed my pain. I knew that Isabella had not only replaced Sarah in those days of deceit, but she was becoming part of our family with her own sincere heart. One night, while I was cleaning the kitchen, Stephen called me into the living room. He was standing there holding a small ring with trembling hands. His gaze was a mixture of nerves and determination. Isabella was by his side, her face flushed and her eyes shining. Stephen knelt down and his voice broke. "Isabella, I don't want to waste any more time. You brought light to me and Matthew. Would you accept being my wife and Matthew's mother?" Isabella burst into tears, looking at me as if seeking my approval. I approached her, took her hand, and nodded gently. "You deserve it, honey. You are already part of this family and have been for a long time." She hugged me, her tears wet my shoulder, and I knew that was the moment my family began to heal. Stephen and Isabella's wedding was soon after something small but full of love. I was in the yard looking at the red roses tied to the fence, listening to Matthew's laughter as he wore his little suit, being his dad's little best man. Daniel flew back from a work trip and stood next to his brother with a smile as radiant as the day he first put on his pilot's uniform. I sat in the front row with tears rolling down my cheeks. They were not tears of loss, but of happiness. I looked at Isabella in her simple wedding dress, holding Stephen's hand, and I knew my family had found a sincere heart after having lost a fraud. Life after that slowly returned to calm. Isabella kept her simple life, taking care of Stephen and Matthew with all her love. She cooked hot meals, saying, "You are my sunshine" to Matthew, to put him to sleep the same one I sang to my sons. Every night she sat next to Stephen, listening to him talk about his plans, his projects, with a look full of pride. Matthew no longer asked about his other mother. He just snuggled with Isabella, calling her Mom with a radiant smile. I looked at my family and saw how the wounds were closing little by little. One late night, I sat on the porch. The wind was blowing gently in the garden. Matthew's laughter could be heard from inside, mixed with Isabella's sweet voice. I peeked in and saw Stephen focused on his work, while Isabella prepared him a cup of tea, placed it beside him, and gave him a soft kiss on the forehead. I smiled, feeling my heart finally at rest. I thought about the long road I had traveled, from the first doubts from Daniel's call to that gloomy alley where I discovered the truth. The truth had been cruel, but as Robert used to say, "The truth will set you free, Stella." And so it was. The truth set us free. It brought us Isabella, and it gave us a new beginning, much brighter and happier. The story you have just heard has had names and places changed to protect the identity of the people involved. We do not tell this to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes? I truly wonder, if you were in my place, What would you do? Would you choose to remain silent to keep the peace, or would you dare to face it all to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story is like a candle that can light someone else's path. God always blesses, and I am convinced that courage leads us to better days. Meanwhile, on the end screen, I leave you with two of the most beloved stories on the channel. I'm sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.